Welcome to Witchway's Folklore and Fairytales. I'm your host Elise, and this is an adventure with witches at Wallsend. Upon a time, one of the lords of Seaton Delaval was returning home from Newcastle after nightfall, and his way lying near the old chapel, now in ruins on an eminence near Wallsend, he was surprised to observe the interior of the edifice brilliantly lighted. Riding forward with the undaunted recklessness which in those days characterized many of the border families, he left his horse in charge of his servant at the gate of the burying ground which surrounded the chapel, and proceeded forward to gratify his curiosity. Upon a table, at each corner of which was placed an inverted human skull, containing some inflammable substance that burned brightly, lay the body of a female, uncoffined and partly unrolled from the winding cloth. Around it, occupied in the preparations of charms, sat a number of withered hags, one of whom was at that instant employed with a short knife in cutting the left breast from the corpse. The uncouth visages of those who formed the company, considering the purposes for which they were assembled, might well have appalled a stout heart, and we cannot say that when Delaval looked upon them, his blood circulated through his veins with its wonted regularity. He stood, however, still for a time, and could observe the thin grey beards of several of the party as they turned occasionally their sunken eyes to the skulls which were flaming before them. He also perceived that when the beldam who operated as dissector had severed from the body the left breast already mentioned, it was delivered to an attendant who removed it beyond the range of his view in the direction of the belfry. Delaval now applied his strength to the door or window at which he stood, burst it open, and entered, to the sudden dismay and consternation of the assembly, each of whom endeavoured to provide for safety by flight. He rushed upon her, in whose hand the knife still gleamed, wrenched it from her, and his attempt to secure her, in defiance of her curses, was at last successful. Some of the company escaped by the way through which he entered, others ascended to the roof and took their departure through the openings at the belfry. These spaces also served to convey away the smoke from a fire which the workers of iniquity had kindled on the floor, and above it a cauldron or kettle was suspended from a beam by the rope with which the sexton usually rang the bell. The fire was fed with broken pieces of coffins. The breast, which was cut from the body of the female with other filthy ingredients, were boiling in the kettle, over which fat and froth descended with a fizzing noise, sometimes allaying and again invigorating the flame. When Delaval had witnessed all of these unhallowed objects, he hastened off with his captive and bound her on horseback behind the servant. He kept her securely until she was tried for the crime, and whether this was accomplished by virtue of his own authority or that of a jury, we cannot now decide. She was, however, sentenced to be burnt on the seashore in the vicinity of Seaton Delaval. When the order was about to be carried into execution, she requested to have the use of 2 new wooden dishes, which were forthwith procured from a neighbouring village. The wood and combustibles were heaped on the sands, the culprit was placed therein, the dishes were given to her, and fire was applied to the pile. As the smoke rose in dense columns around her, she placed a foot in each of the utensils, muttered a spell, cleared herself from the fastenings at the stake, and soared away on the sea breeze like an eagle escaped from the hands of its captors. When she arose to a considerable height, one of the dishes which supported her lost its efficacy from having been, by the young person who procured them, dipped unthinkingly amongst water, and after making several gyrations, the deluded follower of Satan fell to the ground. Without affording her another chance of escape, the beholders then conveyed her back to the pile, and she perished amidst its flames. This tale comes from the local historian's table book of remarkable occurrences, historical facts, traditions, legendary and descriptive ballads connected with the countries of Newcastle upon Tyne, Northumberland, and Durham, by M.A. Richardson, from 1843. This is certainly the most interesting escape by a witch I have heard in a folk tale so far, having use of wooden plates to fly away from her captors. Let me know other strange tales and your favourite folklore and fairy tale witches, and you might hear these tales here on Witch Ways, Folklore and Fairy Tales.